The words you use are quietly destroying your credibility. The hidden psychology of speech, influence, and personal power. Introduction. Every sentence reveals the person behind it. Most people believe communication is about words. It is not. Communication is about emotional state. The words themselves matter, but the psychology beneath the words matters far more. Because human beings are constantly reading each other unconsciously. Not only listening to what is being said but sensing. Confidence, insecurity, nervousness, desperation, emotional stability, fear. Self-trust. Every sentence reveals something about the nervous system behind it. This happens automatically. A person says, "Sorry, this might sound stupid," and immediately, the listener feels uncertainty. Another person says, "I may be wrong, but here's what I think." The energy changes completely. Why? Because language communicates identity. It reveals how someone sees themselves internally. Most people focus only on vocabulary. But credibility is deeply psychological. People trust emotional certainty more than intellectual perfection. This is why some individuals command attention effortlessly even with simple words, while others lose respect despite being intelligent. The difference is often emotional congruence. The calmness beneath the speech. The certainty behind the sentence. The nervous system speaking underneath the language. Human beings detect insecurity quickly. Not consciously at first. Emotionally. Through hesitation, over explaining, nervous laughter, excessive apologies, defensive tone, approval seeking language, rushed speech, constant self-correction. These signals quietly communicate, "I do not fully trust myself." And when someone does not trust themselves, other people often stop trusting them too. This is one of the harshest truths about communication. Your words teach people how to perceive you. Not because people are cruel. Because language reflects internal psychology. For example, a person constantly says, "Sorry. Maybe. I guess. This is probably dumb. I don't know if this makes sense. Never mind. It's okay. Whatever you want." Over time, these patterns weaken presence. Not because politeness is wrong. Because chronic self-minimization changes perception psychologically. The listener unconsciously feels uncertainty, lack of conviction, emotional fragility, low self-trust. Meanwhile, emotionally grounded people communicate differently. Not aggressively. Not arrogantly. Clearly. Calmly. Directly. They do not constantly apologize for existing. They do not desperately seek permission before speaking. They do not collapse under silence. They trust their own presence enough to remain composed. This creates authority naturally. And authority is rarely about dominance. It is about emotional stability. The nervous system can feel when someone believes in themselves internally. This is why two people can say the exact same sentence and create completely different reactions. One sounds uncertain. The other sounds grounded. Same words. Different nervous system. Modern society quietly damages communication psychology. Especially social media. People are now rewarded for performance, exaggeration, emotional manipulation, attention-seeking, validation-driven communication. Many individuals no longer communicate to express truth. They communicate to manage perception. To appear intelligent, funny, important, superior, successful, relevant. This creates performative speech, language disconnected from authenticity, and audiences feel this disconnection unconsciously. Because emotionally, human beings trust congruence. When words and emotional energy align, communication feels believable. When they do not align, credibility weakens. This is why overcompensation often backfires psychologically. A deeply insecure person may speak too loudly, brag excessively, dominate conversations, interrupt constantly, not because they feel powerful, because they are trying to escape feelings of inadequacy internally. The nervous system overperforms to hide insecurity. But emotionally grounded people rarely need constant performance. They are comfortable with pauses, silence, disagreement, uncertainty, not impressing everyone. That comfort creates presence. And presence creates influence. This is why calm communicators often appear more powerful than loud communicators. Because emotional control signals internal safety. People trust nervous systems that feel regulated. This applies everywhere. Relationships, leadership, friendships, business interviews, public speaking, dating. Social media, family dynamics. Your communication patterns quietly shape how others experience you. But most importantly, they shape how you experience yourself. Because language reinforces identity. A person constantly apologizing unconsciously reinforces, I am a burden. A person constantly over-explaining reinforces, I must earn acceptance. A person constantly self-deprecating reinforces, I should minimize myself before others reject me. Words train the nervous system psychologically. The way you speak eventually becomes the way you see yourself. This is why communication healing is not merely about sounding more confident. It is about rebuilding internal self-trust. The goal is not becoming dominant, not becoming manipulative, not becoming emotionally cold. The goal is learning how to communicate from groundedness instead of fear. From self-respect instead of approval seeking. From calmness instead of performance. This changes life profoundly. Because once someone stops speaking from insecurity, their entire presence changes. People listen differently, respond differently, respect them differently, but most importantly, they begin respecting themselves differently. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: long before people evaluate your intelligence, they feel your relationship with yourself through the way you speak. Chapter 1. The language of insecurity. Insecurity has a voice. Most people hear it every day, without realizing it. Not through obvious fear, through subtle language patterns, tiny verbal habits that quietly communicate self-doubt, approval-seeking, emotional uncertainty, fear of rejection, lack of internal grounding. And the dangerous part is this: most insecure speech sounds normal in modern society. So people never question it. But emotionally, human beings react to language psychologically, not just intellectually. A person says, "This is probably stupid, but," and immediately, credibility weakens. Not because the idea lacks value. Because the speaker emotionally framed themselves as uncertain before even expressing the thought. The nervous system revealed insecurity first. This happens constantly. People weaken themselves verbally through over-apologizing, over-explaining, self-deprecating humor, nervous qualifiers, permission-seeking language, excessive softening. These patterns often appear harmless. But over time, they reshape perception, both externally and internally. Because language trains identity. For example, someone constantly says, "Sorry." Not because they made mistakes, but because they feel psychologically intrusive. Sorry for asking questions. Sorry for existing. Sorry for needing space. Sorry for speaking honestly. This is rarely about politeness alone. Often, it reflects nervous system conditioning. The person unconsciously learned, my presence may inconvenience others. So they minimize themselves constantly through speech. This becomes emotional self-erasure disguised as kindness. Another common insecurity pattern is excessive softening. Phrases like, "I could be wrong, maybe. Kind of. I guess. Just my opinion. This might not make sense." Used occasionally, these phrases are harmless. But chronically used, they signal lack of self-trust. The person fears sounding too direct, too confident, too visible. Why? Because insecure nervous systems fear judgment. Directness feels emotionally risky. So the speaker softens everything preemptively to avoid rejection. This is psychologically important. Many people communicate cautiously because they are afraid of emotional consequences. Afraid of conflict, embarrassment, criticism, disapproval, appearing unintelligent. So their language becomes defensive before danger even appears. This creates weak communication energy. Not because the person lacks intelligence. Because fear shapes expression. One of the clearest signs of insecure communication is over-explaining. The person cannot simply say, "I cannot come." They say, "I'm so sorry. Things have been really busy lately and I've been overwhelmed and honestly I just need some rest," and the explanation keeps expanding. Why? Because the nervous system fears disappointing people. The person unconsciously believes, "If I fully explain myself, maybe they will still approve of me." This creates approval-based communication. The individual tries to emotionally manage other people's reactions through excessive justification. But ironically, over-explaining often weakens credibility. Why? Because emotionally grounded people trust themselves enough to communicate clearly without endless defense. They understand. Not every decision requires a courtroom argument. Insecure people also tend to ask for permission psychologically before speaking. You hear it in phrases like, "Can I be honest? This might sound weird. You probably won't agree. I don't know if I should say this." The person enters communication already emotionally retreating, preparing for rejection before expression even begins. This weakens presence immediately. Because confidence is not only what you say, it is how safely your nervous system inhabits your own voice. Social conditioning plays a major role here. Many people were raised in environments where expression felt unsafe. A child interrupted constantly may become hesitant. A child criticized harshly may fear speaking incorrectly. A child mocked publicly may develop anxious communication patterns. Over time, the nervous system learns, visibility creates danger. So speech becomes cautious, edited, defensive. The person begins communicating not to express truth, but to avoid emotional risk. This is exhausting psychologically, because insecure communication requires constant self-monitoring. The speaker analyzes tone, reactions, facial expressions, approval signals, possible judgment. The nervous system never fully relaxes. This explains why socially anxious people often feel exhausted after conversations. Not because talking itself is difficult. Because fear-based communication consumes emotional energy. Modern social media intensified this dramatically. People now communicate under constant visibility. Every sentence can be judged publicly, criticized, mocked, misinterpreted. This increases self-consciousness. Many people now write and speak as if an invisible audience is constantly evaluating them. This creates performative communication, not authentic communication. People become terrified of saying the wrong thing, so they over-edit themselves endlessly. But emotionally grounded communication feels different. It is calm, direct, simple, not overly defensive, not desperate for approval. The person trusts themselves enough to tolerate disagreement. This creates authority naturally. Authority is not aggression. It is internal stability expressed through language. The emotionally grounded person does not need to overprove, over-apologize, over-explain, over-soften, over-perform. Because their nervous system no longer treats expression like danger. This does not mean becoming rude or emotionally cold. Healthy communication still includes empathy, kindness, humility. But there is a major difference between humility and self-minimization. Humility says, "I respect others." Self-minimization says, "I do not fully respect my own voice." That distinction matters deeply. Because insecure communication patterns slowly shape identity itself. A person constantly speaking with uncertainty eventually feels uncertain internally. A person constantly apologizing begins feeling like a burden psychologically. A person constantly shrinking verbally begins shrinking emotionally too. Words train the nervous system. This is why communication healing is identity healing. The goal is not becoming dominant, not sounding intimidating, not pretending certainty about everything. The goal is learning how to speak without constantly abandoning yourself emotionally. Without shrinking your thoughts automatically. Without apologizing for existing. Without fearing every disagreement. This creates authentic confidence. And authentic confidence sounds different. It sounds calm. Grounded. Present. Not because the person never feels fear, but because fear no longer controls their voice completely. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: insecure language is often not a communication problem. It is a nervous system trying desperately to avoid rejection. Chapter 2. Why nervous people talk too much. Silence makes insecure people uncomfortable. Not because silence is dangerous. Because silence feels emotionally exposing. When conversation pauses, many people suddenly feel something internally: awkwardness, anxiety, pressure, self-consciousness, fear of judgment, and to escape that discomfort, they start talking. Too much. Too fast. Too nervously. Most people think excessive talking comes from confidence. Often, the opposite is true. Many people overtalk because they are psychologically uncomfortable with stillness. The nervous system interprets silence as social danger. So speech becomes self-protection. The person fills every quiet moment with explanations, stories, jokes, nervous laughter, unnecessary details, constant talking. Not because they have nothing valuable to say. Because they are trying to manage emotional tension internally. This is deeply psychological. A calm nervous system can tolerate silence. An anxious nervous system feels threatened by it. Why? Because silence removes distraction. And without distraction, the person becomes aware of themselves. Aware of how they are being perceived, whether they are accepted, whether they sound intelligent, whether others approve of them. This creates performance anxiety. The person unconsciously believes, if I keep talking, I can control the interaction. If I stay entertaining, they will like me. If silence happens, they may judge me. So they overcompensate verbally. This becomes especially common in people who fear rejection deeply. Talking becomes a way to earn connection. Earn approval. Earn emotional safety. The nervous system starts associating silence with loss of control. This is why some people answer simple questions with 5-minute explanations. Not because they lack awareness. Because internally, they are trying to avoid emotional discomfort. Overtalking is often anxiety trying to protect identity. This also explains nervous oversharing. Some people reveal deeply personal information too quickly. Not because intimacy has been earned. Because emotional anxiety weakens boundaries. The person unconsciously tries to create rapid connection through excessive openness. They fear emotional distance. So they overexpose themselves verbally. Later, shame often appears. Why did I say so much? Why couldn't I stop talking? I revealed too much. This creates embarrassment. But underneath the behavior usually exists one powerful emotional need: the need to feel accepted. Many nervous communicators are constantly scanning conversations for validation. Watching facial expressions, tone changes, reactions, approval signals. The nervous system stays hyper alert. And when anxiety rises, speech accelerates. The person interrupts silence before it fully forms. Because silence feels psychologically unsafe. This often begins in childhood. A child raised in emotionally unstable environments may become hypervigilant socially. They learn, I must monitor people carefully. I must manage emotional tension. I must keep connection alive. Some children learn they only received attention when performing socially. Being funny, entertaining, interesting, helpful. So adulthood communication becomes performance-based. The person fears being forgettable, invisible, unimportant. Speech becomes a strategy for emotional relevance. Others learn silence was dangerous emotionally. Perhaps silence in childhood meant anger, punishment, rejection, emotional withdrawal. So now, silence triggers nervous system discomfort automatically. The adult speaks excessively to avoid emotional uncertainty. This creates exhausting communication patterns. The person often leaves conversations feeling drained. Because anxious talking consumes nervous system energy, the body remains activated continuously. This also affects credibility. People trust calmness more than verbal chaos. A person constantly rambling often appears uncertain, emotionally reactive, approval-seeking, ungrounded, even if they are intelligent. Meanwhile, emotionally grounded people communicate differently. They pause naturally, think before speaking, allow silence to exist without panic. This creates authority psychologically. Because calmness signals internal safety, the listener unconsciously feels, this person trusts themselves. That feeling increases credibility instantly. Silence itself becomes powerful. Not forced silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that says, I do not need constant performance to hold presence. This is difficult for anxious communicators initially. Because silence feels vulnerable. Without constant words, the person feels emotionally visible, exposed, unprotected. But healing requires learning to tolerate stillness, to remain present without performing constantly. This changes communication profoundly. The person stops speaking to manage anxiety and starts speaking intentionally. Words become cleaner, more direct, more impactful. Because emotionally grounded people do not use language to escape themselves. They use language to express themselves. There is a major difference. Nervous communicators often speak reactively. Grounded communicators speak consciously. One is driven by fear, the other by presence. Social media has intensified overtalking psychologically. People are now rewarded for constant output, constant commentary, constant reaction, constant visibility. Silence became associated with irrelevance. So many people fear disappearing socially. They feel pressure to keep posting, keep speaking, keep entertaining, keep reacting. The nervous system becomes addicted to external stimulation. Stillness begins feeling emotionally uncomfortable. But emotionally mature people understand something powerful. Constant noise weakens impact. People who speak endlessly are often heard less deeply. Why? Because desperation weakens presence. Calmness strengthens it. This does not mean becoming quiet artificially, or emotionally detached. Authentic communication still includes warmth and personality. But emotionally grounded people no longer fear pauses constantly. They no longer use endless words to earn worth. They trust silence, presence, simplicity, emotional steadiness, and this creates influence naturally. Because powerful communication is rarely about saying more. It is about speaking from internal stability instead of nervous overcompensation. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: people often talk excessively not because they are confident, but because they are afraid silence will reveal how uncomfortable they feel with themselves internally. Chapter 3. The psychology of powerful speech. Powerful people do not always speak the most. But when they speak, people listen. This has very little to do with vocabulary, or intelligence, or volume. Powerful communication is psychological. It comes from emotional regulation, internal steadiness, self-trust. The nervous system behind the words matters more than most people realize. Because human beings unconsciously feel emotional energy before they consciously analyze language. A calm nervous system creates trust. An anxious nervous system creates uncertainty. This is why two people can say identical sentences and create completely different emotional reactions. One sounds grounded. The other sounds nervous. Same words, different emotional state. Most people mistakenly believe authority comes from dominance. Speaking loudly, talking constantly, controlling conversations, projecting superiority. But psychologically, real authority often looks quieter, slower, more emotionally controlled. Because emotionally grounded people are not trying to force belief. They trust their own presence enough to remain calm. This calmness creates influence naturally. The nervous system interprets emotional steadiness as safety. And safety creates credibility. This is why powerful communicators rarely rush themselves verbally. They pause naturally. Think before speaking. Allow silence without panic. Why? Because their self-worth is not dependent on constant performance. An insecure speaker fears silence. A grounded speaker uses silence intentionally. This changes communication completely. Silence becomes part of presence. Part of authority. Part of emotional control. Most people underestimate how psychologically powerful pauses are. Pauses communicate. Confidence, composure. Emotional regulation, thoughtfulness, self-trust. Meanwhile, rushed speech often communicates anxiety, insecurity, fear of judgment, emotional urgency, approval seeking. This does not mean speaking slowly artificially. Forced calmness feels performative too. People unconsciously detect authenticity. The goal is not pretending to be confident. The goal is becoming internally settled enough that calmness happens naturally. This is why emotionally grounded people rarely over-explain themselves. They say what they mean. Clearly. Directly. Without excessive emotional defense. For example, an insecure communicator says, "I'm really sorry. I know this is probably inconvenient and maybe I'm overthinking, but I just feel like maybe." A grounded communicator says, "That does not work for me." Simple. Clear. Emotionally stable. No unnecessary panic underneath the sentence. This is important. Powerful communication is not emotionally loud. It is emotionally regulated. Many people confuse emotional intensity with strength. But uncontrolled intensity often weakens credibility. A person who becomes reactive instantly, speaks impulsively, interrupts constantly, over-defends themselves, escalates emotionally, signals nervous system instability. Meanwhile, emotionally grounded communicators can tolerate disagreement, silence, criticism, uncertainty, emotional tension, without losing composure completely. That ability creates authority. Not because they are emotionless. Because they are emotionally regulated. This difference matters deeply. Real confidence does not remove emotion. It removes desperation. Desperation weakens communication psychologically. People feel it unconsciously. The need to impress, prove, dominate, seek approval when every interaction creates tension. And tension weakens presence. Powerful communicators do not constantly fight for significance. They are internally secure enough not to overperform. This creates conversational gravity. People naturally focus more when someone speaks with calm certainty. Not arrogance. Certainty. Arrogance says, "I need to appear superior." Grounded confidence says, "I trust myself enough not to force anything." This changes body language too. The nervous system affects eye contact, pacing, tone, facial tension, breathing, posture. Communication is never only verbal. The body speaks continuously. An anxious communicator often rushes words, avoids pauses, laughs nervously over smiles, fidgets, fills silence compulsively. The body reveals internal uncertainty. Meanwhile, emotionally grounded people feel more settled physically. Not perfectly relaxed, but less frantic. This creates presence. Presence is difficult to fake long-term. Because presence comes from internal safety. And internal safety changes communication naturally. Many people lose credibility because they are speaking from emotional survival instead of self-trust. They communicate from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of sounding stupid, fear of losing approval, fear of being ignored, fear of conflict. Fear shapes tone, word choice, pacing, energy. This is why communication improvement requires psychological healing too. Not just speech techniques. You can memorize confident phrases, but nervous systems always leak truth eventually. People feel incongruence. Real communication power develops when someone genuinely becomes more emotionally grounded internally. Then speech changes automatically. The person stops, apologizing constantly, defending every decision, over explaining boundaries, seeking permission to exist, panicking under silence. Their words become cleaner, more intentional, more trustworthy. Because the nervous system no longer treats communication like survival. This is why some people hold attention effortlessly without saying much. Their presence feels emotionally solid. And emotional solidity creates influence stronger than performance ever could. Social media has distorted this badly. Modern culture rewards loudness, outrage, exaggeration, constant reaction, attention-seeking behavior, but attention is not the same as authority. Many loud people are not respected deeply. They are merely stimulating. True authority creates calm attention, not chaotic attention. The most emotionally powerful communicators often speak with restraint, not because they lack thoughts, because they understand something psychologically mature. Constant talking reduces impact. When every sentence feels emotionally urgent, nothing feels important anymore. Powerful speakers understand rhythm, stillness, timing, emotional control. Their words carry weight because they are not constantly fighting for validation. This applies everywhere. Leadership, dating, friendships, interviews, business, parenting, social media, public speaking. People trust emotionally regulated communication, not perfect communication. Regulated communication. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: the psychology of powerful speech is not about learning how to sound important. It is about becoming emotionally secure enough that you no longer need to constantly prove your importance through words. Chapter 4. The words that make you sound weak. Most people destroy their credibility long before anyone evaluates their intelligence. They weaken themselves through language. Quietly. Repeatedly. Unconsciously. And the tragedy is, they often believe these speech habits make them sound polite, humble, or likable. But psychologically, many of these patterns communicate something very different: insecurity, fear, approval-seeking, low self-trust, emotional fragility. Human beings constantly interpret emotional signals beneath words. And weak language creates weak perception. Not because people are cruel. Because communication reflects identity. Every sentence reveals how safely someone inhabits themselves internally. One of the biggest credibility killers is excessive apologizing. Not genuine accountability. Excessive apologizing. There is a major difference. Emotionally grounded people apologize when necessary. Insecure people apologize for existing. You hear it everywhere. Sorry for bothering you. Sorry, this is probably dumb. Sorry for talking so much. Sorry, I just had a question. Sorry for taking your time. The person shrinks themselves verbally before interaction even begins. Why? Because the nervous system fears becoming inconvenient. Many people learned early that their needs created tension for others. So adulthood communication becomes filled with self-minimization. The individual unconsciously says, "Please do not see me as a burden." Over time, this damages credibility deeply. Because constant apology communicates lack of internal permission to exist confidently. Another major credibility destroyer is self-deprecating humor. Used occasionally, humor is healthy. But chronic self-insult becomes psychological self-conditioning. People constantly say things like, "I'm so stupid. I'm terrible at everything. Nobody takes me seriously anyway. I'm a mess. I always ruin things," often disguised as jokes. But the nervous system hears repetition. And eventually, other people begin unconsciously accepting the identity you repeatedly assign yourself. This is important. Language trains perception, especially repeated language. People who constantly minimize themselves verbally often attract less respect socially, because they taught others how to perceive them emotionally. Another damaging pattern is defensive communication. Some people explain themselves before criticism even appears. For example, "I know this idea probably isn't very good," or "This may not make sense," or You probably won't agree. The person emotionally retreats before expression begins. Why? Because they fear rejection. So they weaken their own message preemptively, hoping criticism hurts less. But psychologically, this reduces authority immediately. The listener unconsciously thinks, if you do not trust your own words, why should I? This also appears through excessive qualifiers. Maybe. Kind of. Sort of. I guess. Probably. Again, occasional use is normal. But chronic overuse creates uncertain energy. The speaker sounds emotionally ungrounded, afraid to stand fully behind their own thoughts. Why? Because directness feels risky to insecure nervous systems. Clear communication creates visibility. And visibility creates potential judgment. So the person softens everything constantly. This becomes approval-based speech. Communication designed not to express truth, but to avoid emotional discomfort. Another major credibility killer is asking for permission constantly. You hear it in phrases like, "Can I say something? Is it okay if I disagree? I don't know if I should mention this." The person behaves as though their voice requires authorization. This usually reflects deeper conditioning. Perhaps they grew up around criticism, control, invalidation. So now expression feels emotionally unsafe. The nervous system believes, I need approval before I speak honestly. This weakens communication power dramatically. Emotionally grounded people do not seek permission to exist verbally. They still communicate respectfully. But they trust themselves enough to speak clearly. Weak communication also appears through over-explaining. Some people cannot answer simply. A small decision becomes a 10-minute defense. Why? Because they fear being misunderstood, or disliked, or judged negatively. The nervous system believes, if I explain enough, maybe I will remain accepted. So the person floods conversations with justification. But excessive explanation often communicates hidden insecurity. Because emotionally stable people understand, not every decision requires emotional negotiation. This is especially visible in boundary setting. An insecure person says, I'm really sorry, I've just been overwhelmed lately and I feel terrible but I don't think I can make it. A grounded person says, I won't be able to make it. Simple, clear, respectful. No panic underneath the sentence. This is the psychology of authority. Calm communication signals self-trust. Desperate communication signals fear. Modern culture rewards weak communication patterns constantly. People are taught to avoid offending anyone, soften every opinion, apologize excessively, over-explain boundaries, seek endless validation. As a result, many adults communicate from emotional survival instead of groundedness. They fear criticism, rejection, conflict, disapproval, appearing arrogant. So they unconsciously weaken themselves verbally to appear safe. But there is a psychological cost to chronic self-minimization. Eventually, the nervous system internalizes inferiority. The person stops feeling powerful internally because their language continuously reinforces weakness. Words matter. Not only socially, neurologically. The brain listens to your voice constantly. Your nervous system absorbs your communication patterns daily. A person constantly saying, I'm probably wrong, eventually starts feeling wrong emotionally. A person constantly apologizing eventually feels burdensome internally. A person constantly shrinking verbally eventually shrinks psychologically too. This is why communication healing is deeper than speech coaching. It is identity repair. The goal is not becoming aggressive, not becoming dominant, not sounding robotic or cold. The goal is removing fear-based language patterns that quietly destroy self-respect and credibility. This creates grounded communication, clear communication, emotionally regulated communication. And emotionally regulated communication feels powerful because it is no longer begging for approval underneath every sentence. Perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. The words that weaken your credibility usually reveal the places where you still do not fully believe in your own right to exist confidently. Chapter 5. Why people stop respecting you. Respect is rarely lost in one dramatic moment. It disappears slowly, quietly, through repeated emotional signals. And one of the strongest signals people unconsciously respond to is this: how much do you respect yourself? Most people think respect comes from status, money, looks, power, charisma. But psychologically, respect often begins with self-trust. The way someone speaks, carries themselves, sets boundaries, handles pressure, responds to discomfort. All of these communicate emotional positioning. Human beings constantly sense whether someone is internally grounded or emotionally dependent on approval. And emotional dependency changes behavior dramatically. A person desperate to be liked often becomes less respected over time. Not because kindness is weakness. Because desperation weakens presence. There is a major psychological difference between kindness and approval seeking. Kindness comes from emotional fullness. Approval seeking comes from fear. Fear of rejection, abandonment, conflict, disapproval, emotional distance. This fear creates behaviors that quietly reduce credibility. For example, many people constantly over-agree, even when they disagree internally. They laugh at jokes they dislike, accept treatment they resent, hide opinions to avoid tension, say yes when exhausted. Why? Because approval feels emotionally safer than authenticity. The nervous system believes, if I keep everyone comfortable, I will remain accepted. But people unconsciously lose respect for individuals who abandon themselves constantly. Why? Because emotional self-abandonment communicates weak boundaries. And weak boundaries create unstable social positioning. This becomes especially visible in communication. Some people speak as though every sentence requires emotional permission. They over-explain, apologize excessively, seek validation constantly, soften every opinion, fear disagreement, avoid directness. The listener unconsciously feels uncertainty. Not because the person lacks value. Because the person does not fully inhabit their own voice confidently. This is one of the harshest truths in social psychology. People often treat you according to the emotional standards you communicate about yourself. If you constantly minimize yourself verbally, others unconsciously minimize you too. If you constantly tolerate disrespect, others assume disrespect is acceptable. If you constantly betray your own boundaries, people stop taking your limits seriously. This does not mean becoming aggressive, or dominant, or emotionally cold. It means understanding something psychologically important. Respect requires self-respect first. Many people were never taught this, especially individuals raised around emotional instability. Some learned keeping peace mattered more than honesty, being agreeable mattered more than authenticity, avoiding conflict mattered more than self-respect, so adulthood becomes performance. The person becomes emotionally adaptive to everyone around them. Different personality for different audience. Always adjusting. Always pleasing. Always monitoring reactions. This creates social exhaustion. Because the nervous system never fully relaxes, the person is constantly managing perception. And eventually, people begin sensing something. The person does not fully trust themselves. This weakens authority. Not because they are weak internally. Because fear controls expression externally. Another major respect killer is emotional desperation. Desperation appears in many forms. Needing constant reassurance, chasing validation, over texting, over explaining, forcing conversations, fearing silence. Tolerating poor treatment to avoid abandonment. Desperation communicates emotional dependency. And emotional dependency often reduces attraction, authority, and respect psychologically. Why? Because emotionally grounded people do not cling constantly for worth. They value connection, without collapsing into emotional survival around it. This creates stability. And stability creates trust. People respect nervous systems that feel emotionally regulated. Not perfect. Regulated. This is why emotionally reactive individuals often lose credibility during conflict. Someone criticizes them, and they immediately explode, emotionally become defensive, panic. Over-explain, attack. Collapse internally, the nervous system loses composure. Meanwhile, emotionally grounded people can tolerate discomfort without immediate emotional chaos. That tolerance creates authority. Because emotional control signals internal safety. This also changes how people experience boundaries. Individuals without self-respect often fear saying no. Why? Because they associate boundaries with rejection. So they overgive, over-accommodate, over-sacrifice. At first, others may appreciate this. But over time, invisible resentment develops. Because relationships built entirely around self-erasure become emotionally imbalanced. The person feels unseen internally. Used. Emotionally exhausted. Meanwhile, others unconsciously stop respecting their limits. Why? Because no clear limits were communicated consistently. This is why boundaries increase respect psychologically. Not because boundaries intimidate people. Because boundaries communicate self-worth. They say, my needs matter too. My time has value. My emotional well-being deserves protection. This creates emotional solidity. And emotional solidity changes social dynamics immediately. Many people fear that self-respect will make them unlikable. But emotionally healthy people understand something powerful. Being respected matters more than being endlessly accommodating. This does not mean becoming selfish. It means becoming internally aligned. No longer saying yes while feeling resentment internally. No longer speaking dishonestly to avoid discomfort. No longer shrinking to maintain approval. This changes communication energy profoundly. The person becomes calmer, clearer, more direct. Not because they became emotionally hard. Because they stopped negotiating their worth constantly. This also changes relationships dramatically. Emotionally healthy people stop chasing people who repeatedly disrespect them. Stop begging for attention. Stop forcing connection. Stop over-proving their value. Why? Because self-respect changes emotional standards. The nervous system finally learns, I do not need to earn basic dignity through performance. That belief transforms identity. Without it, people spend years trying to convince others to value them. With it, people naturally withdraw from situations that require self-betrayal for acceptance. This creates peace. Not loneliness, peace. Because emotional maturity understands, respect built on performance is fragile. Respect built on authenticity is stable. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. People stop respecting you when you repeatedly communicate, through words, behavior, and boundaries, that you do not fully respect yourself emotionally first. Chapter 6. Silence, presence, and emotional control. Most people are afraid of silence. Not consciously. Psychologically, silence removes distraction. And without distraction, the nervous system suddenly becomes visible. The person becomes aware of themselves, their anxiety, the reactions of others, possible judgment, emotional tension in the room. For insecure people, silence feels dangerous. So they rush to fill it. Talking quickly, explaining unnecessarily, laughing nervously, interrupting pauses constantly, not because they have something important to say, because silence feels emotionally exposing. This is one of the clearest differences between anxious communication and grounded communication. Anxious people fear silence. Emotionally secure people can tolerate it. That tolerance creates presence. And presence is one of the most powerful psychological forces in communication. Because presence communicates internal safety. The nervous system unconsciously says, I do not need constant performance to feel valuable here. Most people underestimate how strongly emotional regulation affects communication. Human beings are constantly sensing Tension. Urgency, nervousness, desperation, calmness, steadiness. Even before consciously analyzing words. This is why someone can enter a room quietly and still command attention. Presence is not loudness. It is emotional groundedness. People trust nervous systems that appear regulated. Not because regulation means perfection. Because calmness signals stability. And stability creates authority psychologically. This is why powerful communicators rarely appear rushed emotionally. They pause naturally. Think before responding. Allow moments of silence without panic. The pause itself communicates confidence. Not performative confidence. Internal confidence. The kind that does not desperately fight for significance every second. Insecure people often fear pauses because pauses create uncertainty. The mind immediately asks, did I say something wrong? Are they judging me? Do they still like me? Should I say more? This activates nervous system anxiety. So the person starts talking again quickly to regain emotional control. But ironically, this often weakens communication. Why? Because emotional urgency reduces perceived stability. People unconsciously trust calm energy more than frantic energy. This becomes especially visible during conflict. Emotionally reactive individuals speak impulsively. They interrupt, escalate quickly, defend excessively, over-explain. Speak emotionally before thinking clearly. Their nervous system loses regulation. Meanwhile, emotionally grounded individuals maintain composure longer. Not because they feel nothing. Because they tolerate emotional discomfort without immediate panic. That ability creates authority. Emotional control is not suppression. This distinction matters deeply. Suppression means emotions exist but are buried forcefully. Emotional control means emotions exist but do not control behavior automatically. This creates psychological strength. Many people confuse emotional intensity with honesty. But emotional intensity often reflects nervous system dysregulation. Especially when communication becomes reactive. Powerful communicators remain connected to themselves while speaking. They do not abandon awareness completely inside emotion. This creates clarity. Clarity creates trust. And trust creates influence. Silence plays a major role in this process. A pause before speaking often communicates thoughtfulness, confidence, self-trust, emotional stability. Meanwhile, compulsive talking often communicates insecurity, discomfort, fear of judgment, emotional overcompensation. This is why silence can feel intimidating initially for insecure people. Silence removes verbal armor. Without constant words, the person feels emotionally visible, exposed, vulnerable. The nervous system no longer has distraction to hide behind. This is why some people fear eye contact too. Eye contact and silence together create psychological exposure. The person feels seen. And insecure nervous systems often associate being seen with judgment. So they avoid stillness unconsciously. Modern culture intensified this dramatically. People now exist inside constant stimulation, constant scrolling, constant commentary, constant reacting, constant noise. Stillness became uncomfortable for many nervous systems. Silence now feels almost unnatural. People reach for phones instantly during pauses. Why? Because stillness creates self-awareness. And many people are deeply uncomfortable alone with themselves emotionally. But emotionally mature people learn something powerful. Silence does not reduce your value. You do not need to entertain constantly, perform constantly, explain constantly, react constantly. Your presence alone can carry weight. This realization changes communication profoundly. The person stops using words to prove worth, and starts using words intentionally. This creates stronger speech automatically. Because fewer words often carry more emotional impact. Not through manipulation. Through clarity. Emotionally grounded communicators understand rhythm, timing, pacing. They allow conversations to breathe. They are not terrified of moments without stimulation. This makes people listen more carefully when they finally speak. Why? Because emotional steadiness creates gravity. People naturally focus on calm nervous systems. This applies everywhere. Leadership, dating, friendships, interviews, public speaking, parenting, negotiations. The ability to remain composed under emotional pressure creates trust instantly. And trust is more persuasive than force. This is why calm communicators often appear more powerful than aggressive communicators. Aggression frequently signals insecurity underneath. The need to dominate, control, overpower, win. Calmness signals internal security. The person no longer needs constant emotional control over the room. This creates authentic authority. Many insecure people fear silence because they secretly fear themselves. Fear what stillness might reveal. Loneliness, insecurity, anxiety, emptiness, unresolved emotion. So they stay surrounded by noise constantly. But healing requires learning how to remain emotionally present without escaping into endless stimulation. This changes the nervous system deeply. The person slowly realizes, I can exist without performing. I can remain calm without constant reassurance. I do not need to fill every silence to deserve space. These beliefs create emotional freedom, not emotional coldness. Freedom from compulsive performance. Freedom from nervous overcompensation. Freedom from fear-driven communication. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. Silence becomes powerful the moment your nervous system no longer interprets stillness as evidence that you are losing value in the eyes of others. Chapter 7. Stop explaining yourself to everyone. One of the clearest signs of emotional insecurity is the constant need to explain yourself. Your decisions, your boundaries, your feelings, your opinions, your existence. Some people cannot simply say, no. They feel compelled to produce an emotional presentation afterward. A long explanation. Detailed reasoning. Excessive justification. Not because the explanation is necessary. Because the nervous system fears disapproval. This is deeply psychological. Many people believe explanation creates safety. They unconsciously think, if people fully understand me, they will not reject me. If I explain enough, they will approve. If I justify myself perfectly, they cannot criticize me. So communication becomes defensive, not expressive. The person is no longer speaking from self-trust. They are speaking from fear of negative reaction. This creates exhausting communication patterns, especially for people conditioned around approval. Some individuals learned early in life that boundaries required permission. That saying no created guilt, disappointment, conflict, punishment. So adulthood communication becomes emotionally cautious. The person cannot simply state needs clearly. They emotionally negotiate for the right to have needs at all. This is why insecure communication often sounds like, I'm really sorry but. I hope you understand. I feel terrible saying this. I normally wouldn't do this but, please don't be upset. The nervous system is attempting to manage the emotional reaction of the other person before it even happens. Why? Because disapproval feels psychologically dangerous. But emotionally grounded people communicate differently. Not coldly. Not arrogantly. Clearly. They understand something emotionally mature. Other people are allowed to feel disappointed without it meaning you did something wrong. That sentence changes everything. Because many people organize their entire communication style around avoiding disappointment, avoiding conflict, avoiding misunderstanding, avoiding rejection. So they over-explain constantly. But excessive explanation often weakens credibility psychologically. Why? Because it communicates hidden fear. The listener unconsciously senses, this person does not fully trust their own right to make decisions. This is especially visible with boundaries. An insecure communicator says, I'm so sorry, things have just been overwhelming and I've been stressed lately and I feel bad but I don't think I can come. A grounded communicator says, I won't be able to make it. Simple. respectful, stable. No emotional collapse underneath the sentence. This is not about becoming emotionally detached. It is about understanding that self-respect does not require endless justification. Many people explain themselves compulsively because they fear being misunderstood. And honestly, being misunderstood hurts. Human beings naturally want connection, validation, understanding, acceptance. But emotionally mature people eventually realize something painful. Some people will misunderstand you no matter how clearly you explain yourself. This realization creates emotional freedom. Because the person stops exhausting themselves trying to control every perception. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every opinion deserves emotional labor. Not every disagreement requires defense. This becomes difficult for approval-conditioned individuals, especially sensitive people. Sensitive individuals often feel emotionally responsible for how others experience them. If someone feels disappointed, they feel guilty. If someone misunderstands them, they panic internally. If someone becomes upset, they immediately try fixing it. The nervous system associates emotional harmony with safety. So the person becomes hyper-explanatory, trying desperately to maintain emotional balance externally. But this creates self-abandonment. The individual sacrifices internal peace trying to manage everyone else's emotional reactions. Eventually, exhaustion appears. Because no human being can maintain psychological health while constantly negotiating their worth through explanation. Another reason people over-explain is fear of rejection. Some individuals believe, if people knew the real reason behind my decision, maybe they would still accept me. So they defend themselves endlessly, trying to appear reasonable enough to deserve approval. But emotionally grounded people understand, your boundaries are valid even when others dislike them. This creates calm communication. Not aggressive communication, calm communication. The kind that does not panic when someone disagrees. There is enormous psychological power in speaking without emotional over-defensiveness. A simple sentence spoken calmly often carries more authority than 10 minutes of anxious justification. Why? Because calmness signals self-trust. And self-trust creates credibility. This is why powerful communicators rarely over-explain. Not because they lack empathy. Because they are not emotionally negotiating for permission to exist honestly. Modern culture has intensified explanation addiction. Social media trains people to constantly defend themselves publicly. Every opinion must be justified. Every choice explained. Every mistake addressed. Every boundary defended. People now feel pressured to emotionally account for their existence constantly. This creates communication fatigue. The nervous system becomes trapped in perpetual self-defense. But emotionally mature individuals stop participating in endless emotional trials. They stop believing, everyone must fully understand me before I can trust myself. Instead, they begin asking, am I being honest with myself? That question changes communication completely. Because authenticity becomes more important than universal approval. This does not mean refusing accountability. Healthy people still apologize when wrong, clarify misunderstandings when necessary, communicate respectfully. But they no longer compulsively defend every personal decision. They understand something psychologically freeing. Disagreement is survivable. Disappointment is survivable. Misunderstanding is survivable. And most importantly, someone else's emotional reaction does not automatically determine your worth. This creates emotional steadiness. The person stops collapsing internally every time someone questions them. Stops panicking every time someone disapproves. Stops abandoning themselves to maintain external harmony. Instead, they remain connected to themselves while communicating. This is emotional maturity. Not dominance. Not emotional coldness. Grounded self-respect. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. The moment you stop compulsively explaining yourself to everyone is often the moment your nervous system finally begins believing that your existence does not require constant justification. Chapter 8. How social media destroyed authentic communication. Human beings no longer communicate the way they once did. Most people are no longer speaking to connect. They are speaking to manage perception. To appear intelligent, attractive, successful, relevant, morally correct, emotionally impressive. Modern communication became performance, and social media accelerated this transformation dramatically. For the first time in human history, millions of people exist under constant psychological visibility. Every thought can be judged, criticized, compared, analyzed, mocked, ignored, validated publicly. This changes the nervous system profoundly. People stop asking, "What do I truly think?" and begin asking, "How will this be perceived?" That shift quietly destroys authenticity. Because authentic communication requires emotional safety, and social media environments often create the opposite, constant self-consciousness. The nervous system becomes hyper-aware of audience reaction, likes, views, comments, approval, engagement. Human beings were never psychologically designed for this level of social exposure. So communication adapts defensively. People begin editing themselves constantly, filtering personality, softening opinions, performing emotion, curating identity. Not because they are fake intentionally. Because visibility activates fear. Fear of rejection, cancellation, criticism, irrelevance, humiliation, social exclusion. This creates performance-based communication. The individual no longer speaks naturally. They speak strategically, emotionally calculated, designed for approval. And eventually, many people lose contact with their authentic voice completely. This is why so much online communication feels emotionally empty, technically polished, but psychologically disconnected. People sense performance unconsciously, even when they cannot explain it logically. Because authenticity has emotional texture, it feels grounded, alive, human. Performative communication feels different. It feels optimized, controlled, filtered, emotionally rehearsed. This is why many influencers appear confident publicly, while feeling deeply anxious privately. Their identity became dependent on audience reaction. The nervous system starts associating worth with visibility. Attention becomes emotional survival. And attention addiction changes communication psychology dramatically. The person begins chasing stimulation constantly, reactions, engagement, validation, approval, emotional intensity. This creates exaggerated communication. Everything becomes louder, more emotional, more dramatic, more provocative, more performative. Why? Because calm authenticity often loses against emotional stimulation online. Algorithms reward attention, not emotional health. So people unconsciously learn, exaggeration gets rewarded. This creates distorted self-expression. Individuals stop communicating honestly, and begin communicating for impact, for clicks, for reactions, for identity management. This slowly damages credibility psychologically. Because communication disconnected from authenticity creates nervous system tension. The person begins splitting into two identities, the public self, the private self. And maintaining this split becomes emotionally exhausting. Many people now feel pressure to appear constantly happy, constantly productive, constantly confident, constantly successful, constantly emotionally evolved. This creates emotional dishonesty. Real human emotion becomes hidden behind branding. Vulnerability becomes performance too. Even pain becomes content. This is psychologically dangerous. Because the nervous system begins treating life itself like an audience experience. Moments are no longer fully lived. They are observed internally as potential presentation. This weakens presence. The person is no longer experiencing reality directly. They are monitoring themselves inside reality, constantly asking, "How do I appear right now?" This creates chronic self-consciousness. And chronic self-consciousness destroys natural communication. Authentic communication requires spontaneity. But performative communication is hyper-controlled. The person becomes terrified of saying the wrong thing, appearing imperfect, losing approval, damaging image, looking foolish. So communication becomes emotionally restricted, safe, predictable, filtered. This is why many people now struggle with real-world conversation too. Their nervous systems became conditioned for edited communication. Online, you can rewrite sentences, delete mistakes, filter emotions, craft responses carefully. Real-life communication does not offer this control. So many people feel anxious during spontaneous interaction. They became disconnected from natural emotional flow. Social media also intensified comparison psychology. People constantly observe curated versions of others. Confidence, beauty, success, charisma, lifestyle. And unconsciously, the nervous system starts competing socially. Communication becomes comparison-driven. The person thinks, how do I sound smarter? How do I appear more impressive? How do I stay relevant? This creates identity performance instead of self-expression. The tragedy is, many people no longer know what their authentic voice sounds like beneath social conditioning. They became fluent in performance, but disconnected from themselves. This especially affects young people. Many adolescents now develop identity publicly online before developing internal self-trust privately. So self-worth becomes externally dependent early. The nervous system learns, visibility equals value. This creates fragile identity structures. A negative comment can feel devastating psychologically. Why? Because identity became attached to perception. Emotionally grounded individuals communicate differently. They are not controlled entirely by audience reaction. They can tolerate disagreement, imperfection, criticism, misunderstanding, lack of validation without collapsing internally. This creates authentic confidence, not performance confidence. There is a huge difference. Performance confidence says, please admire me. Authentic confidence says, this is who I am. One depends on reaction. The other depends on self-connection. This changes communication energy completely. Emotionally grounded people do not need every sentence to impress, stimulate, dominate, go viral, receive applause. They communicate honestly, calmly, clearly. Their nervous system is not constantly chasing emotional reward from attention. This creates peace psychologically, because they are no longer trapped inside public performance. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: social media did not only change how people communicate. It changed how people experience themselves while communicating. Chapter 9. Speaking with calm confidence. Most people misunderstand confidence. They think confidence means speaking loudly, dominating conversations, never doubting yourself, always appearing certain, impressing everyone in the room. But psychologically, true confidence feels very different. Real confidence is calm. Not because confident people never feel fear, but because fear no longer controls their communication completely. Calm confidence comes from internal safety. The nervous system no longer treats every interaction like a threat to identity. This changes speech naturally. The person stops rushing words, over explaining, apologizing, constantly seeking approval in every sentence, panicking under silence, performing for validation. Instead, communication becomes grounded, clear, intentional. This creates credibility immediately, because emotionally regulated people sound trustworthy, not perfect. Trustworthy. The difference matters. Many insecure people attempt to imitate confidence externally. They force deep voices, dominant body language, aggressive communication, performative certainty. But nervous systems leak truth eventually. People unconsciously sense tension underneath performance. Real confidence does not need constant proof. This is one of the clearest psychological markers of grounded individuals. They are not desperately trying to convince everyone of their worth. The need to constantly prove yourself often reveals hidden insecurity. Truly grounded people can tolerate disagreement, criticism, silence, imperfection, not being liked by everyone without emotionally collapsing. This creates emotional steadiness, and emotional steadiness changes communication profoundly. For example, an insecure communicator reacts to disagreement defensively. "No, that's not what I meant. You misunderstood me. Let me explain." A grounded communicator says, "I understand your perspective." No panic. No frantic self-defense. No emotional chaos. This calmness creates authority. Because authority is not force. It is emotional regulation under pressure. Most people lose credibility during emotional discomfort. The nervous system becomes reactive. Voice changes. Speech accelerates, tone sharpens, defensiveness appears, over-explaining begins, fear takes control of communication. But calm confidence allows someone to remain connected to themselves emotionally during tension. That connection creates stability. And stability creates influence. This is why emotionally grounded people often speak more simply. They do not use unnecessary complexity to appear intelligent. They trust clarity. Insecure people often overcomplicate communication trying to sound impressive. Why? Because they fear being perceived as unintelligent. So they overtalk, over-explain, over-perform. But calm confidence does not need linguistic decoration constantly. Simple language spoken with grounded energy often carries more power than complicated language spoken with insecurity. This also changes listening behavior. Confident people do not constantly wait for their turn to speak. They actually listen. Why? Because they are not psychologically trapped in self-performance. Insecure communicators are often hyper-focused on themselves internally. How do I sound? Did that make sense? Do they approve of me? What should I say next? Their nervous system stays trapped in self-monitoring. But calm confidence creates external awareness. The person becomes present instead of performative. This creates deeper connection naturally. People feel emotionally seen around grounded communicators. Not managed. Seen. Another powerful trait of calm confidence is emotional restraint. Modern culture glorifies emotional impulsiveness, immediate reactions, instant opinions, constant expression. But emotionally mature communicators understand something powerful. Not every thought requires immediate expression. This creates emotional discipline. Not suppression. Discipline. The ability to pause before reacting. To regulate emotion before speaking impulsively. To choose clarity over emotional discharge. This makes communication more impactful. Because emotionally reactive people often lose power through lack of control. They speak from temporary emotion instead of grounded awareness. Calm confidence also transforms body language. The nervous system affects eye contact, posture, breathing, facial tension, pacing, movement. An insecure nervous system often appears hurried. A grounded nervous system appears settled. Again, not perfect. Settled. This subtle difference changes how people experience you psychologically. Because calmness signals internal trust. And internal trust becomes externally visible. Many people think confidence comes from external success. But some of the most externally successful people are deeply insecure communicators internally. Why? Because achievement does not automatically create self-worth. Some individuals achieve endlessly trying to finally feel valuable. Their communication still contains defensiveness, approval-seeking, emotional overcompensation, validation, hunger. Meanwhile, genuinely grounded people may speak very quietly, yet still carry enormous presence. Because presence comes from nervous system regulation, not social status. This is why some individuals instantly command respect without forcing it. Their communication feels emotionally congruent. Nothing excessive. Nothing desperate. Nothing performative. Just calm self-connection. And people trust that energy deeply. Calm confidence also changes how someone handles mistakes. Insecure people often panic around imperfection. They over-defend, over-explain, avoid accountability, become emotionally reactive. Why? Because mistakes threaten identity. But grounded people understand, making mistakes does not erase worth. So they can acknowledge errors without collapsing psychologically. This creates maturity. And maturity creates trust. The nervous system no longer experiences every flaw as emotional catastrophe. This creates relaxed communication. The person no longer needs to appear perfect constantly. That freedom changes everything. Because perfectionism destroys authenticity. And authenticity is where real confidence lives. Ultimately, calm confidence is not something you perform. It is something you develop internally. Through self-respect, emotional regulation, boundary work, nervous system healing, self-trust. Authenticity. The stronger your relationship with yourself becomes, the less your communication depends on external validation. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: calm confidence is not the absence of insecurity. It is the ability to remain emotionally grounded even when insecurity briefly appears. Chapter 10. The most dangerous sentence in modern communication. There is one sentence quietly destroying millions of people psychologically. A sentence so common, most people never question it. Yet it reveals one of the deepest insecurities in modern communication. The sentence is, "What will people think?" At first, it sounds harmless, normal, human. And to some extent, it is. Human beings naturally care about social belonging. We are psychologically wired for connection. Acceptance once meant survival. Rejection once meant danger. So the nervous system still reacts strongly to social judgment today. But modern life transformed this fear into something constant. People no longer ask, "What do I believe? What do I need? What feels authentic to me?" Instead, many first ask, "How will this look? Will people approve? Will I embarrass myself? Will they judge me?" And slowly, identity becomes externally controlled. This is one of the greatest psychological traps in modern society, living according to imagined audience reaction. Many people never fully realize how much of their life is shaped by invisible observers inside their minds. They silence opinions, suppress emotions, avoid risks, hide interests, abandon dreams. Stay in unhealthy relationships, refuse authenticity not because they truly want to, but because they fear judgment. This fear changes communication profoundly. The person stops speaking honestly, stops expressing naturally, stops existing freely. Everything becomes filtered through, "How will I be perceived?" This creates chronic self-consciousness. And chronic self-consciousness destroys authenticity. Because authentic communication requires internal freedom. The freedom to sound imperfect, be misunderstood, disagree, appear human, risk rejection. But insecure nervous systems fear all of these deeply. So people begin performing socially. They craft personalities designed for approval. Safe personalities, acceptable personalities, non-threatening personalities. Over time, the person may become highly liked publicly, while feeling deeply disconnected privately. Because approval built on performance never creates real peace. The nervous system knows the acceptance is conditional. It knows they like the version of me I perform, not necessarily the authentic self underneath. This creates emotional exhaustion. Because maintaining image requires constant psychological effort, monitoring behavior, appearance, wording, reactions, emotional expression, social perception. The person becomes trapped inside self-observation. This is why many people feel anxious in social situations. Not because they lack social skills. Because they are hyper-aware of being evaluated. Their nervous system constantly asks, "Am I acceptable right now?" This question silently controls countless lives. People choose careers based on status, relationships based on appearance, opinions based on group approval, communication based on audience reaction, not authenticity. Approval and approval addiction is psychologically dangerous. Because approval can never fully stabilize self-worth. Why? Because public perception constantly changes. Someone praises you today, criticizes you tomorrow. If identity depends entirely on external reaction, emotional stability becomes impossible. This is why emotionally grounded people communicate differently. They still care about others, still value relationships, still practice empathy. But they are no longer psychologically imprisoned by imagined judgment. This creates emotional freedom, not arrogance. Freedom. The freedom to speak honestly without collapsing under disapproval. Many people never experience this freedom because they fear visibility itself. Visibility creates vulnerability. The moment you speak authentically, someone may disagree, misunderstand, reject, criticize, judge. And insecure nervous systems experience this as emotional threat, so the person hides constantly. Not only from others, from themselves. This creates internal fragmentation. The authentic self stays buried underneath social adaptation. Eventually, many people no longer know who they are without audience influence. This is especially dangerous online. Social media intensified imagined observation dramatically. People now feel watched constantly, even alone. The nervous system adapts by becoming performative. The person starts living as though life itself is an audience event. Moments become content. Opinions become branding. Identity becomes presentation. This disconnects people from reality psychologically. Because real life cannot be fully lived while constantly self-monitoring. Presence disappears. Authenticity disappears. Peace disappears. The person becomes emotionally trapped inside perception management. But healing begins when someone asks a different question. Not, what will people think? But, what kind of life will I create if fear of judgment controls every decision? That question changes everything. Because eventually, emotionally mature people realize, no amount of approval can replace self-respect. And no amount of performance can replace authenticity. Some people will misunderstand you no matter what. Some people will criticize you no matter what. Some people will dislike you no matter what. Trying to control every opinion becomes psychological imprisonment. Freedom begins the moment the nervous system understands, I can survive disapproval. This creates authentic communication. The person no longer speaks to avoid judgment constantly. They speak from internal alignment. And that changes presence completely. Because perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: the most dangerous sentence in modern communication is not spoken out loud. It is the silent question controlling millions of people internally. What will people think of me? Conclusion. Your voice reflects your identity. Every person has a voice. But very few people speak from their real one. Most speak from conditioning. From fear. From insecurity. From performance. From emotional survival. Their words are carefully shaped around approval, acceptance, avoiding rejection, controlling perception, protecting identity. And over time, communication stops feeling natural. It becomes psychological armor. The person no longer speaks to express truth. They speak to manage reactions. This is why so many conversations feel emotionally empty now. People are talking constantly, but rarely revealing themselves honestly. Because honest communication requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels dangerous to insecure nervous systems. So people hide behind excessive politeness, over explaining performance, intellectual superiority, humor, constant talking, emotional detachment, anything that prevents real exposure. But eventually, this creates exhaustion. Because pretending requires energy. Constantly monitoring yourself, your tone, your image, your wording, your reactions, how others perceive you keeps the nervous system in a state of tension. The body never fully relaxes when authenticity feels unsafe. This is why communication healing is deeper than speech improvement. It is identity healing. The way you speak reflects How safe you feel, how worthy you feel, how much you trust yourself, how much approval you need, how afraid you are of rejection. Every sentence carries emotional information beneath the words. Human beings sense this unconsciously. This is why some people instantly feel trustworthy, while others feel performative. The nervous system always communicates first. Long before vocabulary matters. Long before intelligence is evaluated. People feel calmness, tension, desperation, insecurity, groundedness, emotional stability beneath language. And the most powerful communicators are rarely the loudest people in the room. They are often the most emotionally regulated, the most internally settled, the least desperate for validation. This creates authenticity. And authenticity creates trust. Modern culture encourages the opposite. People are rewarded for attention-seeking, emotional exaggeration, outrage, constant performance, branding themselves endlessly. As a result, many people lost touch with authentic communication completely. They no longer know how to speak without performing, without editing themselves constantly, without fearing judgment, without seeking approval. But emotional maturity changes this slowly. The person begins realizing, I do not need to sound perfect to deserve respect. I do not need to impress everyone to have value. I do not need to apologize for existing. I do not need constant validation to trust my own voice. These realizations change communication naturally. The nervous system relaxes. Speech slows down. Words become simpler, more honest, more intentional. The person stops forcing presence, because presence begins emerging naturally. This is real confidence. Not domination. Not arrogance. Not emotional coldness. Real confidence sounds calm because calmness reflects internal safety. And internal safety changes everything. Eye contact, pacing, tone, boundaries, listening, emotional control, silence, tolerance. The person no longer communicates from panic. No longer speaks like someone trying desperately to earn permission to exist. This creates psychological freedom. Because many people spend their entire lives unconsciously asking, am I acceptable? Am I impressive enough? Am I likable enough? Am I safe from rejection? And those fears shape communication constantly. But emotionally grounded individuals stop organizing their identity entirely around audience reaction. They stop treating every interaction like emotional evaluation. Instead, they begin speaking from self-connection. This changes relationships profoundly. People trust them more, respect them more, listen more carefully. Why? Because emotionally grounded communication feels stable, not manipulative, not desperate, stable. This also changes the relationship someone has with themselves. The person stops shrinking, verbally apologizing, constantly explaining every boundary, overperforming, intelligence chasing approval through communication, and starts speaking with emotional congruence. The internal self and external voice finally align. This creates peace. Because the nervous system no longer feels divided between who you are and who you think you must appear to be. That alignment is powerful. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: your voice is more than sound. It is the psychological reflection of your relationship with yourself. And the moment you stop speaking from fear, your entire presence changes.